We've been looking at the book of Daniel and observed that its first half contains stories that focus on committing to God, with examples of how he guides individuals that place their trust in him. But the second half contains prophecies that speak of time periods, affirming that something would happen at the end of each of them. Chapter 7 spoke of a judgment that would take power from all nations and replace them with the kingdom that God would set up for eternity. Chapter 8 spoke of another power that would be broken after a certain time and be replaced by the Prince of Princes. It is interesting that after both of these visions, which were about 2 years apart, Daniel felt so much grief that he became physically ill. For the next 13 years, Daniel tried all he could to understand the time periods he had seen in vision. He figured out in that time that the captivity of which he was a part would last for 70 years. He found this from the writings of a contemporary prophet, Jeremiah, who lived in a different part of the empire. In the same breath, while specifying 70 years, Jeremiah also said that the exile would end and the people would return as they confessed their sin and recommitted to God. So Daniel prayed a prayer of confession, seeking forgiveness for himself, his father's line, for the kings of Israel, and from the nation as a whole. In response to this prayer, the archangel Gabriel was sent from God's throne in heaven to reassure him. His reassurance contained another prophetic time period, linking all the previous times mentioned and giving some markers to help identify them. Gabriel speaks of 77s, units of probationary time that would climax in outcomes that would see the end of wickedness and bring in everlasting righteousness. All of this depended on the coming of the Anointed One, who would confirm the covenant for 1/7. This expectancy is reflected in the gospel writings. Mark, for instance, records some of the earliest words of Jesus. "The time is fulfilled," he said, "and the kingdom of God is at hand." And further, think of the expectancy surrounding the birth of Jesus, the coming of the wise men from the east, the words of the old prophet Simeon and the prophetess Anna, all reflect the hope pinpointed in Daniel chapter 9. They saw in this new child the fulfillment of the hope of a deliverer predicted by Daniel. The Apostle Paul also refers to time fulfillment. When the set time had fully come, God sent his Son, born of a woman. And yet more evidence. When the time had come, Luke says, Jesus steadfastly set his face to go to Jerusalem. And Paul, speaking of the same event, says, "In due time, Christ died for the ungodly." And any attempt to kill Jesus prematurely was unsuccessful, because, as John said, his hour had not yet come. So the people in New Testament times understood that time frame that Daniel spoke of was not just for a year or two, but stretched out for another 490 years. Therefore, it cannot be glibly assumed that the so-called year-day principle is a relic of misplaced Christian numerology, but that it was a legitimate measure used by people of New Testament times to help them make sense of their day and to emphasize the significance of their preaching. Even more significant, if the principle is valid in the time periods in chapter 9, then it is equally valid for chapter 8. Remember, this is all pointing to the abolishment of evil and oppression and the beginning of the restoration of the earth that God has promised.